Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and your podcast co-host. Well, friends, you can breathe a sigh of relief and watch your wallets for a few months because the California legislature finally adjourned on Saturday after a really wild and interesting end-of-session period, and I would argue perhaps one unlike what we've seen in recent years. So here to break things down in our annual look back at the end of session that was are members of what we humbly submit to you are our PRI All-Stars, seasoned Sacramento political observers or participants who have a few insightful things to say about what just happened. So with us today are Stephen Greenhut, who's the director of PRI's Free Cities Center. He's also the R Street Institute Western Region director, and he's editorial board member for the Southern California News Group. Steve, welcome.
Oh, thank you.
And also, as always, we have with us my co-host and PRI's communications director, Matt Fleming, who is himself a Southern California News Group columnist, and you might catch his writings in the Sacramento Bee or other places. And like me, he is a recovering Sacramento Politico. Matt, how are you this fine Monday?
Good. Happy to be here.
So let's start with a couple of things that weren't bills or big deals, but really kind of cast a shadow over the end of session period. And we'll start with the death of former Senate President Pro Tem, Member of Congress, and California Democratic Party Chair John Burton. Now, the young'uns listening to our podcast may not have experienced John Burton in all of his glory, but each of us had the opportunity to at least experience him up close in person, or at least be around when he was making his presence felt in the legislature and in our politics. Steve, I'm sure you have a few things to say about the death of John Burton.
We can't quote him too much because he's so known for his expletive-filled quotations. But I read an LA Times obit, which I thought was pretty good, and it said where Willie Brown, who, the former San Francisco mayor and assembly speaker who we interviewed for the Free City Center not long ago, was kind of this dapper figure, kind of almost like a work of art. They described him dapper and cool, a living art. And they described Burton as kind of the rumpled, profane performance artist. And I think that kind of captures it. And he was the architect of the Democratic dominance in the state. Many have argued. I think that's pretty accurate. He was a great fundraiser for the Democrats after he left the legislature. But he was a liberal. Jim Brulty said he was a liberal when it was popular, and he's a liberal when it wasn't popular. There was a certain authenticity about him that I think people like, even though he did some dreadful things. So for those of us who are free market oriented, and his expansion of government and a lot of the union things that he promoted, but I quote him here. He says, "I think government's there to help the people who can't help themselves, and there's a lot of people who can't help themselves." So he was always expanding government.
I came to California more in the tail end of his prominence with the party, and as a lover of politics, he's a fascinating character in the same way that I find Mitch McConnell fascinating, in the same way I find Nancy Pelosi fascinating. Like anybody who can rise to power and maintain power, there's an art form to it, and it's interesting to watch. And it's also interesting, you see it when it doesn't go well, like someone like Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer are particularly bad at being leaders. I think the chair of the National Democratic Party now is particularly terrible at his job. So it's interesting as a lover of politics to watch someone do the job well. Having said that, certainly his death is a tragedy. But, when you clear away all of the fluffery from all the obits that have been written, I mean, if he's the architect of the strength of the California Democratic Party, then I would argue that his efforts have left the state worse off than they were before he started.
I'm fortunate that my time that I came up in the legislature, a lot of these giants were around. And so when you'd watch him presiding as the Senate Pro Tem, I remember you had to actually turn the volume down on the TV because people who were sitting in your office for a meeting, they might be shocked to hear all this cussing and four-letter words that came out of his mouth sitting up on the dais. And, if you walked around the Capitol during that time, you weren't really shocked to see his fashion choices choices, which often I remember it was a brown, kind of a tweed jacket and orange track pants, which is a good look. I highly recommend it to you, Matt. You might want to try that one out. He will be missed, leaves a very kind of complicated legacy, but definitely, with Willie Brown, kind of the last of the giants of that era. The other kind of unusual shadow that was cast over the end of session period was this bizarre decision by Governor Newsom to release the State of the State, and once again, as a letter to the legislature. And he waited all this time. The State of the State usually kind of starts the year. He waited until the occasion of the 175th birthday of California on Admission Day, which was September 9th. And he also issued a 3-minute video to accompany his speech. Now, we all read and watched, so you didn't have to. So, Steve, what do you make of, I don't know if we can call it his State of the State address, but what did you make of the Gavin Newsom State of the State?
Well, I kind of I enjoyed Matt's column this week about it, and he'll obviously speak to his column, but it kind of spoke, as he pointed out, to Newsom's inattention to what's going on in the state, and maybe a focus on his national aspirations. But what really got me, I read the whole thing. It just was a lot of little weird kind of stuff. More than there was the normal talk about the poisonous populism, and we're not cowering in the face of the Trump administration at all. But most of it was just like there's all this a paragraph about reimagining the workforce development by creating regional collaborations that link with job creators. It just was a lot of I don't know, hokum. And he of course talked about we lead the nation in startups. He's missing the key word, which is despite the state's policies. Peace Corps stuff, streamlining California's streamlining spirit. We don't have a streamlining spirit. We have quite the opposite, a spirit of making everything as red tape laden as possible. Contra Matt, though, I'll give him some credit on trying on CEQA reform and housing. I mean, we're still nowhere near where we need to be.
Matt, what say you?
He does talk about the poisonous populism of the right and the anxiety many people were feeling about the state of this country, some of it grounded in real fear about the national economy, but much of it stoked by misinformation and bigotry. And it's like, I just don't know how to put this tactfully, but he's just so full of it. Like, there's no question that there's a problem with poisonous populism of the right, but there's also a problem with poisonous populism of the left. And he can't help but say, oh, it's because of the national economy. But the national economy, it has its challenges, but the California economy is crushing people, and I don't want to let the national economy off the hook because it's getting bad, it's getting worse, and it's largely self-inflicted because of sham economics from the federal government. But, there's plenty of sham economics in the state. Steve just mentioned we're a state of overwhelming regulation. We're going to talk about it, but even in looking through what happened at the end of session, it's like the people in charge really seem to think that they have the ability to configure everything in a way that's going to work. And history has shown time and again that that's not true.
To me, what was the most surprising thing, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by it, but, if you read the letter, if you take that to be the speech, it was a pretty kind of run-of-the-mill State of the State message, and you're kind of left wondering, well, why couldn't you have just stood up there and delivered that speech, other than hubris? And when you watch the video, right, it's his typical shtick these days, with all the vibes and feels about Donald Trump and, why we need to gerrymander. But, I think the whole thing underscores that he isn't particularly interested in governing, and everything he does is about furthering his national ambitions. And it's amazing, though, that legislators still largely go along with what he's dictating, and that kind of bleeds into our end of session issues, which really the last week I would say was dominated by this deal over cap and trade legislation. There were 4 measures dealing with cap and trade and then other kind of related energy issues. How do you all evaluate this much ballyhooed last minute climate and energy deal? Steve?
Here's a case where I think we see that Newsom's national aspirations have a bad side, right, where it seems to cause him to have little attention to what's going on here, but it also has a good side, right? Where he's kind of toned down some of the more aggressive climate change policies, at least temporarily. And so this legislation expands until 2045 from 2030. Some of the deadlines for our carbon-free targets. It allows some increased oil production, makes it easier to get new permits. I think it's clearly a case of trying to keep gas prices low as he runs for president. And, Rivas talked about the year of affordability. Most of what the Democrats want to do in terms of affordability, I just can't see how that's going to increase affordability, since it's mostly an agenda of subsidies and things. But, they were mindful enough to try to keep control of these gas prices, because gas prices are one of those things that people nationwide, if you can say California's gas prices are $2 above the national average, that's not a very good campaign theme if you're running in other states. And they're having us join a Western regional energy market, which is a good idea, right? It gives us access to more energy and could potentially reduce prices. One bill in the package, I guess, creates public ownership of transmission lines, which I don't know. I'd have to do research on that, but that doesn't strike me as a good idea, given that public ownership of anything. I mean, the utilities do a poor enough job maintaining transmission lines, and then all the regulations that have reduced their ability to upgrade them to fight against wildfires count me as skeptical that public ownership of transmission lines. Certainly, the energy companies scored pretty well in the end of the session, which we'll talk about more in the context of wildfires. So I don't know, Matt. What do you think? It looks to me like they're clearly trying to keep a lid on some of these gas prices.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think everything has to be viewed through the lens of Gavin running for president, because if he wins, then he's going to have a cabinet and an administration to fill, and all these people love jobs. It's a jobs program for Democratic lawmakers. I agree with you. I think the regional grid is probably a really interesting idea. There was provisions in there to boost oil production in Kern County. But again, anytime they talk about streamlining permits, they say that, and then there really doesn't ever seem to be more permits produced. Not that I've seen, right? They streamlined CEQA, and it doesn't really seem to provide meaningful change. They did all those press release changes that they made down in Los Angeles to spur the rebuild after the wildfires. That hasn't really seemed to do that much. I'm pretty sure Newsom did something to streamline CEQA for water storage projects. That hasn't really seemed to pan out too much. So, they make these headline announcements, and they sound great, but it remains to be seen whether they're actually going to produce anything. But just like, if everything they're doing is harming consumers in the sense of making gas more unaffordable, which is it's not an insignificant product. I mean, some products, maybe it's a little bit harder if like the cost of chicken goes up, you can compensate because there's substitutions. I mean, gas, there's not a really adequate substitution besides a massive lifestyle change in getting an electric vehicle. And that's not even necessarily cheaper a lot of the time. It just seems like it's arrogant to think that they can, completely reconfigure the economy and our way of doing things effectively. I guess my analysis, if I'm going to put a finer point on it, it's like when I think back to Hayek talking about the knowledge problem. I think it was Hayek who said that, but he talked about the knowledge problem, how central planners don't have the requisite knowledge that the market has. To me, this is just the living embodiment of that. This is the knowledge problem, and I don't see how they're gonna fix it. Will certainly reduce the number of oil spills when tankering that stuff from places like Saudi Arabia or wherever it's coming from.
I think to Matt's point, the thing about the knowledge is that read all the press coverage of what happened, right? And it's how all these bills are Democrat fulfilling their campaign pledges on a key issue for them all session, which was affordability. Yet what's lost in the conversation? It's all of these laws enacted by Democrats over the years on electric vehicles, on gas, on energy, renewable energy, you name it. Well, that's the reason we're having these affordabilities in the first place. So it's very rich to say we're acting on affordability when, well, really the solution is to repeal and reform these very bad measures that they've embraced, and they continue to embrace these bad measures. Another thing I would say is, we're going to talk about the NDA legislation in a moment, but it's so interesting to me that these measures are kind of part of that problem. They're all cooked up at the very last minute in backdoor discussions between the governor governor and the speaker and the pro tem. And they were all passed at the very last minute. Literally, we had to go into session on Saturday because the language came so late. And despite grumblings from the Democratic rank and file, who either wanted to make their own changes to the bill or, express their own policy priorities. And, we're not Pollyanna, but, when you have things that happen behind closed doors, well, that's why you kind of get this rumbling and the well-deserved criticism of the legislature that too much is going on outside the public eye. Another thing kind of along these lines of energy policy were wildfires and wildfire response. It seemed like it cast a shadow also over everything all session long. And you had a little bit of progress on insurance issues, though really a lot more needs to be done. And at the end of the session, we saw the major bill that was passed is, well, of course, ratepayers are going to be socked again with higher bills to refill the state's wildfire fund. So, Steve, how do you evaluate the bills the legislature passed here? Is this, I don't know, it almost seemed like wildfires were an issue that were really kind of forgotten by session's end.
Yeah, I mean, to go to your previous point, Tim, I mean, this last bill that came up, I guess, over the weekend, it was 229 pages. All three of us here have read a lot of bills, and, it's not like reading a novel. You've got to pay a lot. I don't know who actually even read what was in those bills. And like you said, we've taxpayers are on the hook, or ratepayers, the same thing, really, for an extra $9 billion to replenish the state wildfire fund. Now, the utilities need to spend $9 billion to replenish the wildfire fund, but they got this massive protection from liability for causing those wildfires. And to me, liability protections just make it less likely that these regulated utilities, which I always thought are in many ways are like the worst of both worlds of government, and you've got the profit motive and the government protecting your market. I don't know how that's going to prevent wildfires, even though there's supposedly they're going to have to spend some of this more money on prevention. But yeah, you're right. I thought wildfires would have been a bigger deal, and some of the early solutions for dealing with some of the major wildfire problems, related to insurance, brush clearance, PRI's Dan Kolke, we've published him a lot on the Free City Center, and has gone into great detail of what could be done to make it easier to do brush clearance and wildfire prevention. And I don't see any of that. I don't see any of the innovative ideas I heard when I was at a Stanford University panel on wildfires. I don't see any effort to do anything innovative, or they're complicated, but these are things that could easily be done. I don't see any of that. I just see the same old protecting the utilities, spending more money. So I'm not optimistic, Matt, on the wildfire fire issue here.
PG&E is my flyer, and I lived in SMUD before that. SMUD was significantly more effective, cheaper. PG&E is terrible in terms of customer service and quality and cost. And maybe there wasn't a broader point to that, and maybe I just wanted to rail on PG&E for a second. But this idea that ratepayers and taxpayers are going to fund this wildfire payout fund. I mean, honestly, of all the things the state spends my money on, helping people who just lost their house in a fire is one of the least offensive. But I'm with you, Steve, where it's fine that Democratic lawmakers want to blame all of this on climate change. But there are things that could be done to mitigate fire damage. I mean, we saw that, one of the members I used to work for, we had 3 national parks in our district. We had basically all of the High Sierra, and, dead trees were a massive issue. And there are things that the state could do to prioritize getting rid of, a lot of the dead trees and a lot of the brush and stuff like that. It's not going to prevent a fire necessarily. I mean, it might actually, but, it will certainly mitigate fire damage. There's nothing, like you said, there really doesn't seem to be any sort of priority to do that. I don't know everything that's in this 229-page bill. I mean, even as I'm reading the coverage of it, they're like, yeah, consumer advocacy groups and environmental groups are scrambling to read everything that's in the bill. It's like, yeah, I mean, it's a terrible way of making policy. And when you look at, the Los Angeles fires in particular, I can't think of a time where there were so many obvious things that went wrong that should have been taken care of up to that point. brush clearance, adequate water supply, testing the water system. There are a lot of things that could have been done to help mitigate that fire. And there just doesn't seem to be any sort of interest in doing that. All we want to do is solve climate change or control the weather. And, it's fine if that's a priority of the Democrats. I just wish that there was other priorities of things you could do that are tangible and relatively straightforward.
Yeah, we need to build resilience for whatever the climate does rather than try to change the entire world's climate. I'm with you.
Yeah.
So another key part of this issue is water. And once again, despite the very public pronouncements by Governor Newsom promoting his Delta Tunnels legislation, the bill stalled, even in this final end of session climate push. So what's the backstory here? I mean, it seems to me there's so much talk about water when you see the real problems, right, with the water infrastructure in the Southern California wildfires. Everyone is aghast over that, but yet when it's time to finally do something about the problem, it seems like nobody really wants to do anything. Steve, what's your insight here on this?
I think the fact that the Delta Tunnel bill, the tunnel now rather than tunnels, the clock ran out. It would have overhauled permitting, financing, and removed some roadblocks to building that tunnel, which essentially would take water from the north end of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta and tunnel underneath it down to the pumps at Tracy at the south end. And the idea, what happens is you've got the Sacramento River, which one water expert, he describes it as such. You have this 6-lane freeway, and then it runs into a series of dirt paths before the 6-lane freeway picks up at the other end. And it's a way to kind of separate the water conveyance, from the Delta. And then it had a lot of habitat restoration because the Delta's been depleted with subsidence where the land is falling, and saltwater intrusion from the Pacific threatens all that farmland. I'll die on this hill, and I'm probably the only one in Northern California that I think the tunnel project's a good idea. We needed something, of course, after the peripheral canal disaster in the 1990s, where it was just defeated by overwhelming margins in the north part of the state. Well, we still need to fix the Delta situation and keep the water flowing without it being subject to finding a couple of Delta smelt at the pumps. But Newsom has talked about this. I mean, the idea went back to the Brown administration, but he wanted to make one tunnel rather than two. But has he used any political capital to make it happen or make some sort of water fix? And he hasn't. And obviously, this fell by the wayside because you can only focus on so many bills, controversial bills at the last minute. And now it basically he had other battles he wanted to fight, as one of the analyses I read put it. So it fell by the wayside, and now we're years and nothing's happening with this. So water has not been a priority for the Newsom administration, and that's too bad.
It's like, how often the legislature uses terms like existential threat. We hear that all the time about everything. But we never hear it about water. And lack of access to water is an existential threat. Without question, by any definition, it's an existential threat. I think the fact that this is just another year where, Newsom hasn't really done much to secure California's water future, it just signals more weakness and more indifference from him. I mean, I just don't understand how he takes this case nationally and says, I deserve a promotion, because I really just even, Steve, we are on the opinion side. We both came up as news reporters. We both strive to be objective in how we, write and how we investigate these types of issues. And it's objectively, I do not understand what case Newsom thinks he's going to make to the national public, because what is his success? He got some school lunch money and won an award for it by, activist educators. I mean, at the end of his term, California is not going to be in a better position than it was when he started. And I know I'm kind of derailing it to make this about Newsom, but this is what Newsom said we needed. And, we need it. And yet we still haven't gotten it, but instead we've got, sassy tweets from his communications department and not much else.
Well, it's the latest version of, a big check presentation, or as I always like to say, picking up trash wearing the little tight-fitting California Bear jacket. But that's exactly right. your thought on this is exactly right. So here's another one that popped up that I think is along these lines of this California way of Gavin Newsom's that I write about, and it's AB 1340 and SB 13 or SB 371, both of which passed. And it's I guess you would call it a deal where Uber and Lyft were able to reduce the amount of insurance coverage that they're required to provide in exchange for kind of tacitly supporting another bill that would make it easier for Uber and Lyft drivers to unionize. And boy, it seems like a real step backward for Uber and Lyft to me, which campaigned so forcefully against AB5, even passed their own measure at the ballot box, kind of set up their own scheme for how to deal with groups like Uber and Lyft and kind of carve it out of AB5. Steve, what do you make of this kind of messy deal here?
Yeah, I feel like they had no choice, right? And they get something significant. They get much lower insurance requirements. The state Supreme Court, in upholding Proposition 22, which is the proposition that exempted ride-sharing drivers from AB5, the court ruled in favor of the ride-sharing companies, but they rejected a portion of it, of Prop 22, that would not allow drivers to unionize. So then, of course, the unions came and they used that as leverage to secure this unionization deal, which I agree is a bad thing. It's going to raise costs. It's going to make it more difficult for this model to survive. But I imagine that the companies realize that this at least removes the effort by the legislature and the unions to try to put them out of business. But what really annoys me is this has been going on for 7 years. So we have, in 2018, there was the Dynamics decision by the state Supreme Court, which created that ludicrous ABC test for determining when you could use contractors. And of course, they did not allow these companies to use contractors. It was the case related to a delivery company, except in very narrow circumstances. And then the legislature and passed, and Newsom signed AB5, which basically codified that decision. But then it caused this huge disaster, and they had to exempt about 100 industries because it was essentially a ban on freelancing. And what really angered me was in the middle of the COVID-19 stay-at-home orders, when people were struggling to make ends meet, the state doubled down on enforcing AB5, which basically wouldn't allow many people to be freelancers, contractors, or working from home. And I just can't understand why the state, why the governor continues to hammer these companies who create, it's an amazing service, right? And it's even made cab companies up their game. Remember how awful cabs used to be? And now they suddenly have improved, because had they not, they would have gone out of business. So it's a win-win for everyone. It provides drivers with fill-in income. It provides consumers with much better cab-type service. And yet our legislature and our governor continues to go after these companies. And this deal will not put them out of business, but it will raise costs and make them less efficient. And it's just a shame that they couldn't have seen this as the valuable, wonderful thing that it was, this industry, and instead have just been hammering them. And what does the message send to other businesses? You come up with a fabulous idea, and our state government wants to put you out of business.
Yeah, it's funny. It's an interesting contrast with the State of the State letter, where he's bragging about innovation, and it's like, wow, you have this really innovative, paradigm shifting business model and service, and it's so effective that we're in fact going to regulate it into mirroring the business model that was failing and no longer works. It's a really interesting approach to supporting innovation. But so walk me through this. So are Uber and Lyft drivers still independent contractors?
Yes, they're still allowed to be independent contractors, and this bill will allow them to somehow unionize by exempting them from a labor law.
That's what I don't get. How do you unionize if you're an independent contractor?
I honestly have no idea how it's going to play out, but I assume it's going to be some novel model for unionizing. But we all talk to our Uber drivers when we take it. They like what they're doing. They're working. Some of them are working 5 or 6 hours a week just to make a little extra money between their jobs and school. So I just don't, there just doesn't seem to, this isn't driven by the drivers, I guess, right?
No,
The drivers seem happy, but it's the unions that aren't happy, right? So that's what kills me, Matt.
it's an anti-competition measure by unions, right? And they're trying to bolster the union workforce because people have decided that they aren't interested in joining unions, which you can see with the declining union participation rates in the state.
Well, and I call out Uber and Lyft here because I think it's very disappointing to see them go along with this because remember, the deal, right, is on, well, their cars don't have to have as much insurance covered. It's customers at the end of the day who pay all these higher costs, especially the higher insurance costs. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think we as Uber riders are going to feel better knowing that the cars are less insured. And so to me, when I was looking at this bill, and I generally don't agree with this point of view, but when you hear, especially people on the right talk about there's really not that much of a difference between the motivations of big business and big government. Well, when you see bills like this, you kind of get what they're talking about here, right? The whole point of AB 5 and all Prop 22 and all that was really to prevent things like this happening and preserve worker freedom. And it just shows at the end of the day, well, Uber and Lyft didn't care about that. They just cared about their business model. So I think it's all a very disappointing effort at the end of the day.
Tim, I just think they were kind of put in a position where, and I don't know their motivations, but that they just want to survive after spending all these years fighting against these efforts that would have essentially put their model out of business. This will keep their model going.
Well, they thought that coming up with this kind of cutesy, that was one of the criticisms, right, at the time was, well, why didn't you just sponsor a repeal of AB 5, which would have passed had they done so? But they were just interested in basically kind of making a good business deal for them. And you can't begrudge it, but that was disappointing too. I would say at the end of the day, they're not necessarily waving the flag on worker freedom. They're waving the flag on what's a good business deal for themselves. Well, another thing that voters are certainly going to be asked to weigh in on some of these things are transportation. And there were two big transportation bills that passed at the end of session. There was a $750 million bailout to keep Bay Area transit agencies afloat that the San Francisco legislators and others were negotiating with the budget. And there's also a measure that passed to put a Bay Area regional transportation tax for voter consideration on the 2026 ballot. Then there was the emergence of another $15 billion for high-speed rail in the cap and trade deal, which will allegedly give it the resources that are needed to build the first phase of the train, which, as you all know, is the train to nowhere. So it seems like with these bills, Democrats are really all in on, it's all the government planners that Steve writes about in his Free City Centers work, right? It's we're having government dictating how we get around, whether consumers actually want to get around that way in the first piece. So, Steve, what say you on all of these last-minute transportation measures?
Yeah, I'd like to start by asking readers to look at our Free City Center. We've written quite a bit about these different Bay Area transit bailout plans. And, ridership has been going down, and the ridership was going down before COVID, right? So there's something fundamentally wrong with the way these transit agencies, BART and the other Bay Area transit agencies are run, and they get all this money to carry them through COVID, and now they're asking for more money, and the $750 million, which Newsom balked at first, but then approved. It's like a stopgap until they presumably voters approve this tax, and they just they never address the fundamental causes of the problem, which is they have bad service. I mean, we just saw they had this system-wide outage for multiple hours, and all the many problems. They've finally gotten a handle on the crime problem, but the crime problem was pretty bad on BART. And then I looked at Transparent California, and I looked at the first 100 entries for the latest data, and there were more than 100 people who were earning between $300,000 and $535,000 in total compensation in BART. So they're never going to do anything about these outrageous salary scales that are driving all the spending. So we have this big infrastructure of big spending transit, and there's never any effort to reform. And my booklet for Free City Center on transportation was called "Putting Customers First." It's a free download, listeners, and it's about how these transit agencies don't put customers first. They put the unions first, and they put their bureaucracies first. And giving them more money is not going to solve it. And then just briefly on high-speed rail, could you imagine the number of the state's problems we could have solved if we weren't spending on this rail system that it doesn't seem as if anybody's going to even ride? I mean, the deal, the state agreed to spend $1 billion annually up to 2045 to offset the federal cuts, but it was supposed to be completed in 2020, and it's already $100 million over budget. And I'm sorry, but how many people are going to take our high-speed rail from Merced to Bakersfield? It's just, that ties also back to this climate change agenda, where it's this fantasy about getting us out of our cars rather than treating these transportation systems as transportation systems. It's more social engineering over transportation engineering.
Matt, what say you?
I've never ridden BART, but I can say that growing up in the DC area, public transportation, like the DC Metro system, was a real big bonus for the community. But it did start to fall into a death spiral the same way some of these other public transportation systems have, where, they can't raise rates fast enough to keep up with expenses. There's a declining quality, which means ridership goes down, which means there's even more of a need to increase rates. And, it just becomes this death spiral. And knowing what I know about the Bay Area, which is how it's constructed, which is constructed very similar in the same way DC is, where you have to get across rivers, and it's just that it's a traffic nightmare. To the extent it alleviates traffic, that's a really good thing. More money has to come with reforms. Otherwise, you're just going to keep pumping money into it. I mean, I do think at the end of the day, like certain public transportation systems, if we're going to spend money on anything, that's not a bad thing to spend money on. You have to operate in reality where there have to be certain hard decisions need to be made. And just because some people are standing outside of a BART board of directors meeting saying that rate increases or fare evasion enforcement, that's all racist. I mean, it's fine that they have a point of view, but at the end of the day, boards of directors need to make real decisions, and the legislature and local taxpayers bailing out these systems is probably not the best way to do it. High-speed rail is a ridiculous idea. It's been proven ridiculous and infeasible it passed in 2008, so the last almost 20 years. And to keep pumping more money into it, I mean, Steve is exactly right. Like, look, if there was a high-speed rail system that was A, high speed, B, affordable, C, got through the mountains effectively, it might actually be a really compelling public benefit.
Well, I think if we say that, Democrats really worship at the altar of climate change, I think it's pretty clear with these bills that, they go to Bible study at their nearest high-speed rail station. We're going to close, as I always enjoy, closing these things with a chef's choice to let our esteemed panelists share their thoughts on a bill that was especially interesting to them or maybe didn't get the coverage that the issue warranted. And we'll start with Matt on this one, and I know he has a really interesting one that kind of goes with our theme of things going on behind closed doors at the Capitol.
I can't remember if it was last year or earlier this year. I think it was last year. It came to light through excellent reporting from the Capitol Press Corps that in discussions to increase the minimum wage for fast food workers and create this ridiculous fast food council where the state is going to regulate the fast food industry, it came to light that groups were using NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, during the discussions. And the extent to which they were used is unknown because people signed NDAs, but some things that did come out were the governor giving carve-outs to, friends of his, the owner of Panera in particular, to exempt them from the negative effects of the law. One assembly member, my assembly member, a Republican, which makes this story all the more heroic, just got through, I believe it was unanimous, I have to go back and double check, but just got through the legislature a ban on the use of NDAs in legislative discussions. I think he said he had to water it down a bit it, but moved the ball forward. Some, we'll see if the governor signs it. But, it's a win for transparency. Hopefully, Assemblyman Patterson can make it go a little bit further. But, especially when this is public business we're talking about, there just should never be non-disclosure agreements used in negotiations. I mean, the concept is so foreign to good government. Again, not to keep railing on it, but every time the governor talks about how great, California does in terms of governing, things like this pop up, and it's so unbelievably corrupt. There's a little bit of privacy that's afforded to constituents in their interaction with offices, and then there's private conversations that happen, and I don't think that can ever be avoided. But using NDAs is so unbelievably corrupt, and I'm glad Assemblyman Patterson was able to push it through. And I'm really glad that the legislature came together to ban the use of it, even though presumably they're the ones letting it go on. But whatever. I'm glad that I never want to give anyone too hard of a time for doing the right thing.
Steve, I know you've been interested in, obviously, with your regular writing and all the issues related to housing. And I know you have served up for us some insight on probably the highest profile housing measure that was considered this year, and really intriguing one. A lot of interesting backstory, SB 79.
Yeah, that one it allows high density housing by transit hubs, and then it has a formula for making it easier to build as you get farther from the station. I like the idea. I think it's one of the most far-reaching bills to allow more housing. Now, the problem, as I point to early and often on Free City Center, is that the state needs to deregulate and provide reforms for market rate housing, and not just the dense housing that they prefer. But I'll still, and this is where I differ with some people, I'll still take these ones that deregulate to allow higher density housing. But we just need to do that across the board for all types of housing: market rate housing, single family homes, suburban homes, urban homes, infill, all of it. We need more housing. So SB 79 is one of the farthest reaching bills. It did get some, I know Josh Hoover, Republican, supported it. It had union support, obviously. There was a lot of hysteria about it that I think was overwrought. In fact, I saw somebody sent me some LA folk singer sent a kind of a hilarious song that he wrote opposing it, referring to Wienerville. So Scott Wiener's the senator who authored this and many other bills. So this one created a lot more pushback. I don't think it's going to create any harm on single family neighborhoods. I think it's a good idea. But the state needs to just deregulate everything and let the market fill the need, rather than trying to force us only those projects that they like. But that said, I like it. I like more things being built faster, easier. And then, this is our chef's choice, Tim. So that was the entree. But just real quick on the dessert here is that the Al Maritsuchi, his bill to really constrain the growth of charter schools, failed at the end, and an alternative bill passed that maybe has some problems, isn't the greatest thing. But it was interesting to see the unions lose that battle, don't you think?
Very much so. I mean, I think that was one of the most intriguing little debates that we've had in some time. And Senator Ashby did say with her bill, Senate Bill 414, that she negotiated with everybody, and she did. She said she took 55 different amendments, and she did also negotiate with CTA and include some of the things they were looking for. But it's rare to see CTA take such a big defeat in the legislature at the last minute. Usually they dominate these sorts of things. Now, for listeners who may not know the backstory, there were some audits calling into question some of the spending on field trips and things that, may seem a little strange by nature, though. Hey, I remember I went to a traditional public school. We went on field trips to Great America and such, so it's not like traditional public school kids aren't having these opportunities. But the charter schools that were affected are non-classroom based charter schools and essentially homeschoolers. And Gavin Newsom on down are opponents of charter schools. CTA in particular, really, they're not fans of homeschoolers. We had a growth in homeschooling, certainly. In some ways, it was a reaction to what parents saw during the pandemic when they saw saw, for themselves with their own eyes, the inability, A, to open the schools, and B, what Zoom school ended up being when it was finally convened on the rare days when it was convened. So I think the big question, Steve, on this bill is, will Gavin Newsom sign this bill or will he veto it? And have we heard the last on this? Are they going to come back with a vengeance in 2026? That is going to be interesting to me to see. And with that, we're out of time for our annual look back at the end of session that was. Thanks to Steve Greenhut, thanks to Matt Fleming, and thanks to all of you for listening today. And we hope you'll join us again next week for another great episode of Next Round.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.